con la colaboración de ITEC Psicología y Neurocorp.
A poco que te adentres en el análisis de conducta, seguro que te vas a encontrar con una serie de nombres. El primero, por supuesto, Skinner. También Keller y Schonfeld, los natos y Ward del análisis de conducta. Y otros como Sidman, Nasrin. Nuestro invitado de hoy, Charles Catania, también es uno de esos nombres destacados. Y no solo por sus numerosas aportaciones en investigación, revistas, libros, sino también por compartir espacio con todas estas grandes figuras. Fue alumno de Keller y Schonfeld, fue ayudante de los seminarios de Skinner, y de esta época nos contará anécdotas muy interesantes y divertidas, al tiempo que nos hablará sobre análisis de conducta, la importancia del estudio de la conducta verbal y cómo fue su intento de aproximación a las ciencias cognitivas, entre otras muchas cosas. Y como siempre, antes de ir con el episodio, recordarles que estamos ya llegando al final de la temporada, que se aproxima una nueva temporada con mucho contenido en formatos novedosos, más vídeos en la calle, más vídeos en persona. Y si quieres colaborar con nosotros para ayudarnos a traer todo este nuevo contenido, en la descripción tienes cómo hacerlo. Oye, ya que estás, déjanos en comentarios otras eminencias de la psicología o del análisis de conducta que quieras ver en el canal. Y poco más. Bueno, sí, un pequeño disclaimer. Hemos hecho la entrevista en inglés y lo tenemos un poquito oxidado. Si te pones nervioso o nerviosa por escucharnos hablar inglés, créeme, nosotros también nos ponemos nerviosos escuchándonos, pero hemos hecho lo mejor posible. Y seguro que igualmente vas a disfrutar esta entrevista con Charles Catania, así que vamos con ella.
Desde Libertia os presentamos las primeras jornadas de análisis funcional aplicado. El viernes podremos escuchar a María Jesús Frosan Parga. El sábado a Natalia Andrés López e Irene Fernández Pinto. Se llevarán a cabo los días 16 y 17 de septiembre en el Hotel Agumar de Madrid. Apúntate ahora en www.institutolibertia.com.
Hi everybody, welcome to another Engram episode, and today we have with us Charles Catania. First of all, we want you to introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you say? And for the audience, we have to say sorry because our English is not the best, so sorry if anyone don't understand us. We will try to translate it all the best we can. So welcome back to the question. Who is Charles Catania? What do you do? And to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a behavior analyst. A long time ago, I called myself a psychologist, but I think psychology has become so many different things to different people that I find myself more comfortable talking about myself as a behavior analyst. That's really what I still do. My training was in experimental psychology.
Mm-hmm.
I was very lucky because my first teacher was Fred Keller. And some people who listen to this will know that Fred Keller was a graduate student at Harvard when B.F. Skinner arrived, and they became friends. Keller was a little bit senior. And eventually, years later, Keller saw the direction that Skinner's work was taking and began to teach it. And he created a curriculum for undergraduate students, and I was very lucky to be one of the students who got into that curriculum and to have this field introduced to me by Fred Keller. That course back then, I will give away my age. I took that course in the academic year 1954, 1955. I was a kid who grew up in New York City. I lived at home with my parents. I took the subway down to the campus and never imagined in those days that I'd be able to find something that would really be something I wanted to devote my life to working with. Keller was a charming teacher. And also we had labs. The introductory psychology course that Fred Keller taught in those days was a rat lab. And so we got our first rats and we shaped lever pressing. The spring semester of that course, we did experiments with our other students as subjects. So we graduated from rats to humans.
Mhm.
And we even did some experiments on verbal behavior. Now, to put that in perspective, Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, didn't appear until 1957. And so the fact that verbal behavior was taught in Keller's course even before the book came out is somewhat significant, I think. So back then we learned about verbal shaping by responding differentially to things that people say. You can change what they say. That's a remarkable and very important thing for us to know about behavior. Um, I went on to take experimental psychology with Nat Schoenfeld, who was a colleague of Fred Keller. In fact, Keller and Schoenfeld, they were the authors of the textbook that we used. And again, I was very, very lucky. I became Keller's teaching assistant. And then I went on to my further graduate work. I took a master's there at Columbia. And then I went to Harvard, where I would eventually work in the pigeon laboratory. And so once again, I had to be lucky. The person who was running the pigeon laboratory at that time was a guy by the name of Lou Golub. And Lou took a position at the University of Maryland just in time for that position to be available. And I was the person around who happened to be most convenient to do that. So I ran the lab. We didn't see Skinner much in those days. He was traveling around the country giving talks, but he was in the department. And every once in a while you could say to another graduate, I had a chance to talk to Skinner for a few minutes, and met him in the hall, and we chatted, and that was a big deal. When I finished my degree and some postdoctoral work, I could not get an academic job at first, and I worked for a couple of years in a drug company doing psychopharmacology and learning a little bit about the effects of drugs and behavior. That was actually very useful because you could think of a drug as a kind of a stimulus. And so you could fit things in and find a context in behavior as we were studying it for these kinds of effects as well. I took a job at New York University, taught, ran a lab, had some students, and after 9 years, actually there were financial problems in my university. They sold the campus I was teaching at that time in 1973. I came to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is the campus I stayed at for most of the rest of my career, and then eventually retired in 2008, except what retirement means to me is that they don't pay me anymore, but I'm still active as I am right here now and talking to you. Over the years, I've done research on basic schedules of reinforcement with pigeons, mostly with pigeons. I've worked with some other organisms as well. I got interested in verbal behavior early on, as I mentioned, because of Keller's course, but I was very fortunate to have a colleague who here at UMBC who was also a student of Nat Schoenfeld's. His name was Elliot Shimoff, and he was already working with another person who was a behavioral sociologist. His name was Bud Matthews. And so we got to talking and eventually decided to start doing research on human behavior, and particularly human behavior on schedules of reinforcement. We found that humans don't behave when they're working with schedules of reinforcement anywhere near the way pigeons and other nonverbal creatures do. And in resolving that question, we finally got ourselves into the situation where we began studying the shaping of verbal behavior. And that, I think, has been one of the most interesting areas of research that I've gotten into, because if you regard verbal behavior as behavior that is a function of contingencies, just like any other kind of behavior, then you have to stop thinking of words as being instruments of reason as being rational and logical. Instead, you have to think of what their functions are. And the simplest function verbal behavior can have, and probably the reason why it evolved in our human behavior, is that it's a very simple way in which one individual can get another individual to do something. If I were next to you in your studio and I tried to lift you up, it would
You
be
would have a problem.
hard. But if I said, please stand up,
Mhm.
well, why don't you please stand up?
Levántate.
Okay. Think of what I managed to do. I couldn't do it physically if I was there trying to lift you up, but just by making these sounds, I made you do something. I got you to do something. Thank you for not resisting.
You're welcome.
But really, once you start seeing that as one of the simplest functions, if you expand upon the ways in which that works, you can see other things later following from it. Truth and logic and science are a derivative of those kinds of things. You tell people how they can do things. But if you take that view, it is also less mysterious that politicians can get people to vote for them. Rationality has very little to do with it. And we're seeing some of the really difficult and frightening consequences of that property of verbal behavior. Around the world, there are people who make things happen, who are in positions to tell other people what to do, to invade other countries, and all of those are products of verbal behavior. It's important for us to understand it. And if part of that is that verbal behavior is itself shaped by its consequences, then we really need to understand that. And yet it's very hard for us to get to that point, to get this kind of appreciation of our science out to a broader audience. If a very large proportion of the population of the world appreciated how verbal behavior can be used to push other kinds of behavior around, at least be in a position to defend themselves better. And it is a source of many of the problems in the world today.
Okay.
I've summarized what I do. I hope that's
Yes.
good. If you want any follow-up questions about me, please feel free.
We would like to know about Skinner. We would like to know more about this psychologist, because he's one of the most important of the history, and you have been with him. So if you can tell us about Skinner.
Well, actually, I had limited interaction with Skinner as a student. As I mentioned earlier, when I was a graduate student, yes, the lab was there. He had created all of those things. We read his works. He wasn't around a lot. You would occasionally see him. He didn't even teach many courses formally. There was some, but so he was more of a model. He was also well, maybe the best thing to do is to tell a couple of stories. Okay,
go ahead.
One I did as a postdoc. Once I became a postdoc, I had the responsibility of helping out. Skinner taught a course to undergraduates. It was Natural Sciences NatSci 114, we called it, Natural Sciences 114. And it was taken by Harvard undergraduates. And Skinner had written a book for that course specifically. You may know of it. It's called Science and Human Behavior. He had changed from writing things that were very much data-based and very formal to a much more informal style in Science and Human Behavior. But one of the things he did in that course was to have some demonstrations, and it was my job to prepare some of these demonstrations in one particular year. Now, all of those of us who were graduate students at around that time recognized the importance of Skinner's work and what he was doing. But we also had a sort of informal competition. We wanted to prove to ourselves that he was human, fallible, and every so often somebody would pick out something that Skinner had written somewhere, and then would try to do some research to show that Skinner had been wrong about something. For example, at the end of the book, Verbal Behavior are some added pieces, and one of them was a piece on animal cries. And Skinner there had said that animal cries are essentially analogous to, well, not so much Pavlovian kinds of behavior, but they were species specific, and they were not very sensitive to reinforcing consequences. Well, it turns out that in some ways Skinner was correct about that, but not in every way, because one colleague of mine, a graduate student, a graduate student named Harlan Lane, started working with chicks and started working with schedules of reinforcement. For those who are not too familiar with schedules, a response can produce a consequence, but not every response does so. And you can arrange it so the response produces its consequence after a certain number of instances, in which case we call it a ratio schedule, and that tends to produce high rates, or the response at certain times will then produce a consequence. We call that an interval schedule. It tends to generate low rates. And Harlan Lane started arranging reinforcers for the chirping of chicks. These are relatively young birds, recently hatched, and they would chirp away. And he could show that with schedules of reinforcement, he could get high rates with ratios and lower rates with intervals. He could differentially reinforce higher and lower rates of chirping. And therefore, he concluded that, in fact, these chirps were susceptible to reinforcing consequences, and therefore Skinner was not quite right in that section he had written about animal cries. So that was one case, and a couple of other people did various other sorts of things. But Skinner was still correct in the sense that you could change the rate and the patterning in time of these chirps, but you could not change the topographies of the chirps themselves. They were fairly fixed. Just as Skinner had talked about the pecking of the pigeon pecks on key. And even very early on, Skinner said, well, that peck is a response with a certain genetic unity. It to occur, and when it occurs, it has a certain characteristic, that are constant. But you can also there manipulate when it occurs and how often it occurs and whether it occurs more or less often. Well, here I was in the position of setting up these demonstrations for Skinner, and he left his teaching assistants, people like me who were doing these things, with a fair amount of leeway. He did want to demonstrate a little bit of schedules. He did usually want to demonstrate what then he called superstition, and I'll come back to that in a moment. He also wanted to demonstrate stimulus control, that you could get a different performance in the presence of one stimulus on the key than in another stimulus on the key, or what we call discrimination. So I was able to set all of those things up. I had one bird where the main preparation for the demonstration was that this bird was feeder trained. And if we put it in the chamber in front of the class and operated the feeder, the bird would come right away to eat. We didn't wait for it to teach it that in the classroom. Well, if you operate the feeder at regular, not too long intervals, like every 20 seconds, then the first time the feeder comes up, the bird is doing something. The feeder comes up, it goes and eats. the feeder drops down, it's likely to repeat what it happened to be doing. And so again, the feeder comes up while the bird is doing the same thing. Now, Skinner saw that as particularly important, and he started talking about the capture of that accidental relationship of behavior by the reinforcer as superstition. But every bird would be different. And once they started doing something, it would drift over time. If you kept on doing this for a long period of time, you'd find that gradually that behavior changed to something else. Well, our demonstration was fine because we only went a few minutes, and this particular bird happened to be moving its beak toward the ceiling of the chamber. And so Skinner turned to the class and said, "Look, the bird is looking toward the great reinforcer in the sky." And it was successful. Now, I mentioned superstition in particular, not simply because it was part of this demonstration, but also because it stayed as part of the concern that people had as they did experiments. Because if you deliver reinforcers, and even though they're independent of behavior, the idea was that you could create all these problems because you get these accidental correlations building in behavior, and it might not be the behavior you want to see. What Skinner didn't acknowledge back then, and what it took us a very long time to discover, is that and the very fact that the behavior is highly variable is a clue, is that it's not a long-term worry. Animals are very sensitive to whether their behavior is producing consequences, and they will eventually behave differently if their behavior is producing a consequence or if their behavior is accidentally followed by something that happens. And the reason that was a problem is that people were afraid of just breaking the relationship between the response and the stimulus. They wanted to just take that reinforcer away. So the message became, oh, I've got this child who is engaging in problem behavior. When I want to check out at the supermarket, and we're taking the child past the candy and all the other things at the checkout, and this child starts to cry or something, and I could give the child some candy, but then it's an accidental relationship. We have to break this relationship. And therefore we must extinguish that response. We must stop reinforcing it. Well, then you get the child throwing a tantrum, and you're in the supermarket. You have every other customer looking at you. But this was the message that people who were taking courses in sort of just the basic courses, especially in psychology, would get. If you don't like this behavior, just stop reinforcing it. Well, I used to lecture that way too. But later on, as I got more involved with the applied work, and I worked near here, I live not far away from the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins University. And there they have many children with developmental problems, children on the autism spectrum, some of whom engage in self-injurious behavior. They'll bite themselves. They'll do other things that are problems. And I began to be involved with the people there because we were developing a joint program in applied behavior analysis with UMBC and with the Kennedy Krieger Institute at Hopkins. And I began talking to the people who did that, and they said, "Well, we don't do extinction on the wards. If this child's self-injurious behavior is maintained by social reinforcers, if the parent pay more attention to the child when the child is banging his head than when the child is behaving in some less worrisome way, then those reinforcers must be important. Why should we just take them away? No, let's use them constructively." So they began to deliver reinforcers independently of behavior. Once you break the correlation, it may take a little longer. The behavior goes away. It will go away just as it goes away when you take the reinforcer away completely in extinction. And that has become the choice in doing and doing these kinds of applied work. Don't use extinction. It's aversive to everybody involved. Deliver the reinforcers independently. In order to get to the point where people saw this as a productive way to move from problem behavior that's maintained by reinforcers to delivering those reinforcers independently of behavior and then shaping other stuff, had to give up on the worry, the old worries about superstition. And that's happened gradually in the field. It's taken half a century to get there. Change is slow in science sometimes. But it's an important thing to know about. But let's get back to the demonstration, because there was another part. Well, yes, it was one of the things was to get a bird who when the key was green would peck according to a ratio schedule, respond at high rates, and the key turned red. And during that time, another schedule operated and the pigeon pecked at lower rates. But I was preparing also this demonstration, and while I was doing it, I was getting one animal eating from the food magazine. And Skinner had often talked about the flapping of the birds. If you've got a bird and you take it out of its home cage, it flaps vigorously when you take it out. And Skinner said, well, that behavior is not is emotional behavior. It's not reinforceable. And well, there I was working on this. And I was also teaching my first course. I was teaching a course in comparative psychology. And one of the things I did in that course was I spent some time on motor systems and locomotion in animals. And then I spent some time on sensory systems and so on. And when I studied motor systems, I had done some reading to give a couple of lectures on flight in birds. And flight in birds is kind of interesting because most birds have two modes of flight. They have a very vigorous flight in taking off, and the wings actually push down against the air and they get themselves going. But then they get themselves up to airspeed and the wings stay out, and it's mainly the wingtips that are flapping, and the feathers are moving back and forth. And actually the feathers are actually functioning like propellers. The feathers give the bird the forward thrust, and the airfoil of the wings gives them the lift. Those two kinds of flight, the vigorous takeoff, are governed by different muscles. As you know, birds have the light meat and the dark meat. Well, the dark meat is typically postural muscle, and it has lots of myoglobin in it. And those muscles can work for a long period of time. The white meat doesn't have myoglobin in it, and mainly it can keep going depending on the blood supply. And those white meat muscles fatigue much more rapidly. So the bird can do that vigorous stuff, but very soon it has to stop. If it can't get up to airspeed, it has to come down and land. So I knew about those kinds of things about the bird muscles. And so there I was working with this bird for the demonstration, and it began to flap in front of the feeder. So I did operate the feeder and reinforce that flap, but then I turned the lights off and let the bird rest, because I knew that if I kept the bird flapping for a long time, those muscles would fatigue. Then a little bit, I turned things on. And what I did was I created schedule control of wing flapping. And I brought that demonstration into class. Now, that was, when I think back on doing it, I find it remarkable that I did it, because I was essentially demonstrating in front of this whole class of undergraduates that wing flapping can be reinforced, even though Skinner had said it couldn't. And then I went further. I demonstrated the pigeon flapping its wings, changing schedules. And then I closed by saying, and now that we've taught this bird to flap, our next step is going to be to shape its flying. Well, this is really a story that's relevant to Skinner, because he didn't get angry. If you showed him data, that was it. He was persuaded by the data. But he turned to me and he said, "Charlie, you really should have told me ahead of time that you were going to do that." It was never any. I could imagine with some other academics that, how could you have done that? Would have been, but no, he was very rarely seen angry, very rarely seen critical of students. He would go with it, and if you could show him data, that's all that mattered. And so that was it. He was a very gentle person. As I say, I didn't have a lot of interactions. I did those certain tasks for him. We built some apparatus for particular things. By that time, he was so involved outside of the university and traveled to give talks and so on that we didn't see much of him. And he was withdrawing from the active participation in the laboratory at the time when I was there. In fact, I later was privileged as I became involved in a journal called Behavioral and Brain Sciences. That was a journal that would publish an article, and then lots of people would write commentaries, and then the author would respond. And we got Skinner to then participate in that with some of his classic papers. So we had and one of them was Selection by Consequences. So that paper was sent out to a bunch of commentators. They wrote commentaries, and then Skinner responded to all of them. And then the whole thing eventually got published, not only in the journal, but later as a book with 6 different pieces that he worked on. And in the course of that, because I was involved in the editorship, I had lots of correspondence with Skinner, phone calls and all. And I think I interacted more with him in that project than I ever had during all the time I was a graduate student. And it was obviously a daunting kind of thing, but a very rewarding thing. And one amazing part of it was I'd read these papers, and then I'd see the commentaries, and I'd start thinking about how I would reply. And then I saw what Skinner did, and it was something totally different. It had never occurred to me to reply that way. It's a fascinating project. Now, we'll probably talk a little bit more about verbal behavior. And one of the other things that happened when I was a graduate student there was the first year I arrived, this young linguist from MIT came to give a talk in the psychology department at Harvard. And Skinner was in the audience. His name, you might guess, was Noam Chomsky. And the talk was on his transformational grammar. And Skinner was sitting there in the audience. And Chomsky never mentioned this paper that was already probably written at that time, that was to come out that following spring, which was his review in the journal Language of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. And there were some questions. Skinner asked Chomsky some questions, and things went back and forth. It was a kind of it was just the beginning of an interaction. We had no idea then what was going to happen, but that review came out later, and most of the people who looked at it at the time thought, well, what does that have to do with Skinner's book? Because the review did not seem well targeting the book. I think we can summarize the differences between them, by the way, and with two different things, I'll say.
Yeah.
And remind me to come back, because I introduced Chomsky because I wanted to say something about the behavioral and brain sciences thing.
Okay.
2 things were important here. One is that Chomsky was a linguist, and his main concerns were structure. He wanted to talk about what determined the grammaticality of sentences. Sentences were grammatical. They could be grammatical in different ways in different languages, but the concern was the grammar of the sentences. And it didn't matter what the person said, so long as they said it in the grammar of the particular language they were speaking at the time. Structure was the important thing. Skinner didn't care about structure. If you were at the table and you said, "I'm thirsty," and someone passed you the water, or you said, "Please pass me the water," either way, you got the water. The sentences were very different. But as far as Skinner was concerned, they were members of the same verbal class because they had the same consequence.
Mhm.
Skinner was interested in function. Well, if you were a biologist and you're interested in structure, you'd call yourself an anatomist. If you're a biologist and you're interested in function, you'd call yourself a physiologist. And in biology, anatomy and physiology were two very different parts of the discipline, and those people went off and did their separate things. Nowadays, structure and function are now understood well enough that you can start to, if you want to talk about the function of DNA, you've got to know about its structure, of course.
Mhm.
But over the year, in the early days of biology, there were debates about the priority of anatomy over physiology. Some people would say anatomy comes first and so on. And the others, no, physiology comes first. Well, we are in a primitive stage of our discipline in which it has not been clear to us that some people can study structure and other people can study function, and they don't have much to say to each other. I think that you can look at what Chomsky did and look at what the things that cognitive psychologists did with those structures over time, and they were asking different kinds of questions. Skinner was especially interested in the many generations who've come after him who are interested in teaching verbal behavior, especially with kids who have problems, like kids on the autism spectrum. They had to learn to attend to the function. What consequences did this kind of behavior have? If you look at it that way, it's sort of sad to see a history in which you have these divisions in which people wouldn't even recognize or regard the other's work as legitimate. And Chomsky's review was critical work that essentially led to shutting down interest in verbal behavior over a very long period of time. Another dimension of this was that when this was happening, the Russians had put up their satellite called Sputnik. The United States was behind in the space race. It suddenly became important to translate Russian scientific literature into English. And Chomsky at MIT, with all the clout of its beginnings of work with computers, was making claims for computers that would translate to language translation. And they still basically do a good job if you mainly want to be a tourist and have it translate for you. But that meant there was lots and lots of money at stake. And my interpretation is that one reason to get the behaviorists out of the picture was didn't want them competing for the same grant funds and the same financial support and research support that you could get in an administration that was especially interested in language translation and these sorts of things. So I think these two dimensions of things, one in the nature of the subject matter and the other in the nature of what was at stake in terms of support, underlie all of those kinds of interactions. So, but getting back to the behavior and brain science, that the interaction between Skinner and Chomsky over the book Verbal Behavior was back in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But this book was done in the 1980s, okay, a long time afterwards, decades afterwards. It turns out that Stephen Harnad, who was the main editor, and he was responsible for who got the who had the opportunity to write commentaries. We were talking about the book once we were beginning to wrap the project up. You remember there were 6 different sets of papers by Skinner that commentators were recruited for. And Stephen said, well, yes, I did send an invitation out to Chomsky for all 6 of these. And he didn't write a commentary about any one of them. And this is sort of off the record, but what Chomsky said, according to Stephen Harnad at the time was, well, he said, when I wrote my review of Verbal Behavior and later when I wrote my review of Beyond Freedom and Dignity, I thought Skinner was dangerous. I don't think he's dangerous anymore. this Chomsky, reportedly Chomsky in the 1980s. A couple of decades later, I had an opportunity to accidentally to be involved in a correspondence with Chomsky. Actually, I could call him Noam because the correspondence was in the first name thing. I got an email from him, "Dear Charlie," and he signed it Noam, and so it's nice to be able to name drop, but Stephen felt that we ought to get confirmation from Chomsky. And remember, now this is a couple of decades after that journal project was over, and he in that correspondence said no, he never said that. And it might be that he'd forgotten over time, but it was certainly vivid at the time we heard it. So that's a little bit of background of interactions and so forth. I had to stop and give you a chance for other questions.
Okay. We want to continue with talking about other figures in psychology that you have met in your life. Which other important professionals have you been with?
Well, I came along at an interesting time. I've already mentioned Fred Keller and Nat Schoenfeld, my teachers. I've had accidental encounters with a lot of people. Actually, the things that I'm more willing to, more interested in talking about, as I've gotten further and further involved in the biological end of things, and thinking about behavior in terms of selection, I've gotten more and more interested in Darwin, for example. And of course, I never could have met Darwin. He lived in the 19th century. In Skinner's early work, it sort of sounds like you're reading a physics kind of science. There were laws of behavior, and there were psychologists like Clark Hull who were writing equations. And the model science for psychologists was physics, because there was all the sensory stuff and this work on vision and on hearing, and you had to know acoustics and you had to know optics. And so the way people wrote things and dealt with things were like they did in the physical sciences. But there are two kinds of sciences. There are the sciences that are sort of universal. Presumably, the laws of physics hold throughout the universe, and we've done pretty well in figuring out things that are going on in other stars and other galaxies. And it does seem like a black hole at the center of our galaxy is like a black hole, although different in size from one in a distant galaxy. But if you get to biology, the details of biology are specific to life on our planet as we know it. And some people like to refer to then biology as a historical science. It's a science that is involved with the particulars of our planet and what's happened to us and other species on our planet. Behavior is like that too. It's specific to the organisms we know that have evolved in our planet. Evolution, as Darwin would have talked about it, occurs in the service of behavior. All the organisms that evolved in our planet had to be able to avoid predators, find their own food, drink, find mates. And so the evolution of their muscular system and their skeletal system depended on how they allowed these organisms to behave. So behavior is very fundamental. And so I've been reading more and more about biological sciences and find that there are marvelous parallels. Skinner was beginning to write more like a biologist by the time you get to 1953 in his book, Science and Human Behavior, which I mentioned earlier. And there's one little paragraph in that book in which he compares Darwinian evolution and the evolution of species to the evolution of behavior in the lifetime of the individual organism. He was talking about shaping. And he was saying, essentially was saying, we behave, and our behavior consists of populations of responses that are then selected by their consequences, just as populations of organisms was selected in evolutionary time. So you can look at phylogeny, and then you're talking about Darwin and evolution. You can look at ontogeny, and then you're looking at changes within the lifetime of the individual organism. And then you can go one step further. Skinner later got to talk about is you look at behavior not within the individual organism, but as it's passed on from one individual to another. And one of the main ways we humans do that, there's imitation and there's other kinds of things that do let that happen a bit. But the way we do that is especially through verbal behavior, which adds a third level of selection. We could maybe call it sociogeny, SOCI for social. Well, I've been spending more and more time looking at those parallels and finding that there are all sorts of things that are useful for us who study behavior to learn from those who studied those kinds of systems in biology. So, for example, we talk about short-term and long-term. We talk about whether the animal will take this immediate small reward or will show the self-control to take the bigger one later. That's short-term and long-term at the level of behavior and ontogeny. Well, it turns out there are short-term and long-term consequences in Darwinian evolution too. So, for example, a species might be evolving so that the females prefer certain characteristics on the part of the males that they will eventually mate with. And that, by the way, is Darwinian sexual selection. And we used to argue that the reason for that is that if the female picks out this peacock, which has this very elaborate tail, that for the peacock to survive with that crazy tail, it's got to be a very fit peacock. And that was why it was important. But now we understand that may have nothing to do with it. Once you have a system that's moving in that direction, it can go in that direction. So on the short term, the male may find the mate, but in the long term, that species may be driving itself into a narrower and narrower niche in which it's at risk. So it would be nice if they could show some self-control and not go in that direction, because they're much more threatened with changes in the environment than more general species. So all those kinds of things were going on. But I haven't forgotten that your question was originally psychologists that I've known. But I've some of my interactions have been of a different sort. I was really lucky to have a sabbatical year I spent in England, and during one period of time while I was there, while my wife was off doing other things, she was interested in genealogy, I had an opportunity to visit Down House in Bromley in Kent, which was Darwin's home.
Okay.
And one of my colleagues at UMBC was in the history department, but studied the history of biology. In the year or two before I went there, she had spent a year studying Darwin's notebooks. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Down House and I entered it. It's the place where Darwin worked after he returned from the Beagle. And when I went there was nobody there. People don't go there very often. It's not out of the way. The door was open. There was a little box for putting in a little donation to support the thing. And the curator came out from the back, and I introduced myself as a colleague of Sandra Herbert, who was the biologist who had done her sabbatical, and he welcomed me. And he said, well, come here. And all the rooms had these things, in museums where they have these little things you can't go in, and he unlocked. He said, let's go in here. And we walked into Darwin's study.
Whoa.
Now, you could tell me I might have had the opportunity to meet some famous American psychologists from time to time, and yes, I have at one time or another I've met some of them, often in passing, not to interact very much. But being in Darwin's study was like nothing else. And we walked into the room, and he began handing me that. And this is one thing that he brought back on the Beagle. And this is another thing. And he was letting me handle stuff. And he said, by the way, there's his chair. Would you like to sit in Darwin's chair? In Darwin's chair in Darwin's study. It's one of the few times in my life I felt the hair rise up at the back of my neck.
And was it comfortable?
It was. I mean, they took good care of it. It was just a marvelous experience. It certainly matched just about any time in which I met people as individuals. Of course, it was an amazing thing to meet Skinner and eventually be in the position where I was actually doing things with him, running the laboratory for him. Who else? Well, yeah, I've met some Nobel Prize winners, because at Harvard these people would be coming back and forth all the time. There was a guy named George von Bekeschi who got a Nobel Prize for his work on the ear and how the inner ear worked. That was impressive. There were others whose names are well known that I was less impressed with. George Miller was there when I arrived as a graduate student, and he had a fantastic reputation, and I was interested in his work. But as he moved away and became more and more on the cognitive side of things, I was bothered. So I did know George Miller well enough to be able to talk with him, because I was a graduate student and he remembered me as a graduate student. He once gave a talk at it was the inaugural meeting of the American Psychological the Association for Psychological Science, which became a separate organization from the American Psychological Association. And at the keynote, he gave a keynote talk in which he talked about Skinner's verbal behavior as a stimulus response theory. Well, Skinner's verbal behavior is not a stimulus response theory of language. And so I saw him after the meeting, and I chatted with him a little bit, and I said, I can't quite understand it. In your talk, you know Skinner's work, and yet you described it as a stimulus response theory. And he looked at me and he shook his head and he said, Charlie, what difference does it make? And that really troubled me, because there is in science this thing we sort of appeal to, of at least getting it right and citing things accurately. I think if you go through Chomsky's review of Skinner's verbal behavior, you'll find that he inaccurately describes many things that are in that book. He's looking at it from the perspective of a structuralist who isn't into the functional kinds of issues that we behavior analysts are interested in. And that stuff can be as damaging in science as the fake news can be damaging in politics, which is the thing we all worry about. So, if you want yes, I've met, it's been very satisfying to have met lots of different people. I was at Harvard. I wish I had spent some time getting to know E.O. Wilson, the biologist. I might have actually, but now I could start talking about people who are just a little bit ahead of me. And actually, it astonishes me when I realize how little time separates me from these people. Charlie Ferster was a wonderful contributor to things. He wrote the book Schedules of Reinforcement with Skinner, and was involved in many of the important methodological innovations. He was the first one to show that kids who were in those days described as being psychotic, nowadays we call them kids on the autism spectrum. He was the first one to show you could get them to press something, to make something happen. The psychologists were all astounded, because these kids were supposed to be trapped inside their heads, and to show that anything in the environment could make a difference to them was a major step forward. And so he could be regarded as the founder of these kinds of applications of behavior analysis. Og Lindsley was also one. He preceded me as one of the people to set up the demonstrations for Skinner. He started out actually at Brown University. He was going to go into sensory psychology, but he wanted to go on to the graduate school there, and they had a policy that somebody who was an undergraduate there couldn't go on there. And so he ended up having an opportunity to get a fellowship at Harvard, and instead of getting into the sensory stuff, he ended up getting some support by working for Skinner, and he became converted to the behavioral thing and started methods of recording data and working with psychotics, adult psychotics in psychiatric institutions, and doing a whole wealth of things. He was also a very funny guy. He had a remarkable history. He flew in the Air Force during World War II and was shot down in one of the early air raids, a place called Ploesti. And he spent most of World War II in German prison camps. And so in some ways, he as a person, he reminded me of Kurt Vonnegut, the author. I don't know if you folks are familiar with Vonnegut, but well, who else? There was Murray Sidman. Murray Sidman did a vast amount of research, not just on avoidance, but later created equivalence classes, and upon which other people built. So yeah, it was always fun and exciting to be involved with those people. Joe Brady started working with Sidman. He arranged lots of things, the laboratories for people. He trained the first chimp that went up in NASA missions and came back alive, lever pressing all the way. So yeah, these were people I've met over the years and very much impressed by, and we follow in their footsteps. They set up a lot of things that made it easier for us to do a lot of stuff.
Have you met any Spanish psychologists?
Oh, sure. Well, I meant Carmen Luciano is one I've known. If I could start the names, the trouble is I'd leave out a lot, but quite a few people in Mexico, certainly. And now I not as much opportunity. Sadly, although I have been in other countries in Europe, I never did get to Spain. So I apologize for that. I wish I could do it. I think I've passed my travel days. But in Mexico, yes, and people in a few other countries, and of course, they're Hispanic, but not that closely related to you. But I've also had lots of interactions in Brazil. And so you're separated by Portuguese versus Spanish, but culturally, I think there is a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
And the Daisy de Sousa and João Todorov and others, I think you folks may know of. And I don't know how much interaction you have with the Portuguese. It just happens that because Fred Keller went to Brasilia when Brasilia was new, and taught there, that there are many Brazilians then who are behavior analysts. And I think it would be good ties for you folks to create if you don't have some of them already. But Mexico is very strong in behavior analysis. And of course, it's closer. And so, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I did a webinar with a Mexican group.
We want to change now the topic of the conversation. I want to ask you, which problems do you see in Skinner's behaviorisms? Which are the principal criticals can be done, and the most important points that it introduced for you?
That's a very tall order. I mean, I'm supposed to do that in how much time? 5 minutes?
But don't worry, the
Well,
time you want.
let me say this about it. When I was a student, nobody cared about the difference between applications and the basic science. There was one journal, mainly in the early days in the 1950s. People published in the American Psychological Association journals. There wasn't as much publication across international lines as there is today. And now there's so many different journals, including some that are that I see the tables of contents of, and I can't say the names that in Spain, but in those days there was the one journal. Now eventually the field grew, and for practical reasons it became useful to separate out people who were doing what they call basic experimental analysis behavior and people who are doing applications. And they began to have different boards of editors. And once you have that difference, then you get different communities who don't talk as much to each other. And nowadays people worry about that, and they talk about doing work that will transfer from the basic to the applied. But in those early days, nobody cared about the difference. After all, Skinner not only did his basic work, but he worked on teaching machines. He worked in psychopharmacology, which is certainly an applied area. People began working on drug self-administering monkeys and showing how the things we understood had applications to those areas. Murray Sidman started doing his work with rats, but later on was working with kids. He did the equivalence class stuff by working with a kid who had developmental issues. Charlie Furster was doing pigeon lab stuff and work with other animals, but then he started working with these children on the autism spectrum, then called psychotic in those days. I had already mentioned Og Lindsley, who also did basic work and then started working on psychiatric wards. Nate Azrin was doing work on punishment with pigeons, but then he went on to do token economies with Teodoro Ion. Ted Ion actually did a lot of the starting work on token economies. And in fact, as Nate has sometimes said, that it was really Ted who got those kinds of things started. So in those days, nobody drew distinctions between the applied and the basic. It was all one thing. And if you look at the history of a science, you could say, well, there's this line that goes to the basic research, and there's this other line that goes to the applied research. But applications grow out of a successful science. If the science is successful, then what you should see as time goes on is the applications grow and grow and grow. And that's in fact what happened through the 20th century. Even the ancestors of behavior analysis, like Edward Lee Thorndike, who did work on puzzle boxes initially and who did the animal intelligence stuff. Well, he went on to Teachers College and got into educational applications. John B. Watson, of course, he ended up doing his work in advertising. That created some problems actually in the culture, but it came out of his initial basic work. So I find it hard to try to categorize things. Yeah, the things that may come out and be important 10 years from now may be just a little bit here and there, and we can't be sure yet where they will go. But I see that there's, instead of worrying about what the main themes are, I see that there's a unification in the science. It's all built on this notion that selection is at the heart of what we study. Selection of the consequences of behavior within the lifetime of the individual organism. And once you extend that to verbal behavior gets selected. It gets selected early on in a complex evolution of the child's vocalizations, which create the phonemes in the language the child ends up speaking. That's selection and is a subcategory of the kinds of selection that work at other levels. And once you've got that selection and you can shape verbal behavior, then verbal behavior can determine what people do. And we need to understand more of how that works, how our nonverbal behavior is related to the verbal stuff. It's also really, really important that we teach that outside of our limited numbers and get it out there into our cultures so that more people understand that and can appreciate the dangers as well as the advantages that come from that. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question, but I've tried to at least address the implications for the future. I think we're moving to a time when more and more people do recognize behavior analysis because of its effective applications as something that's worth paying attention to, and it's being more accepted. And we have a more unified kind of message, I think, in that we have these basics to teach than some other approaches.
Okay.
Well, we wanted to ask you something related with that, about the future of psychology, the future of behaviorism. How do you see that?
Well, it all depends on the future of our world. We've got some problems with the planet and global warming and political problems and international tensions. We are a tiny piece of that, and we have to protect what we have. So the future will depend on whether we can turn out students who follow up the work. It's the next generation is going to be more important than us in keeping this work going. I am still optimistic, but I worry. But I don't think we can predict the specifics. We don't know where the next breakthroughs will come. I suspect that there's the tendency to say, well, once we know more about the nervous system, but the nervous system, it serves behavior. In fact, the nervous system kind of adopts itself to the body it finds itself in. So there are people who think, well, okay, if we knew something about how the brain worked, we'd be able to understand verbal behavior. Well, no, it goes the other way around. The environment drives the organization of the nervous system. And maybe that is one of the directions that's important for the future. Those people who are interested in neuroscience and who are interested in behavior might spend their time trying to see how environments can cause the organization of the nervous system. Visual cortex will develop in different ways in somebody who's born with eyes that develop in the ordinary way. But a child who's born without vision, that part of the cortex will end up being devoted to other kinds of things, and the auditory cortex will become more finely differentiated. But it's the environments that are accessible because of what's available at the periphery will determine that development. So I would say if you're the kind of person who would like to go into neurosciences, start with the environment and work in, because if you don't have an understanding of how behavior is selected at the behavioral level, you won't know what to look for in the brain. Skinner put that a long time ago, and he said behavior gives the assignments to the neuroscientists. It tells them what the properties must be of the systems that do it. And then they have to figure out how those systems work. But if they're trying to look for a system that works by associations or Pavlovian stuff, and they're trying to figure how our operant behavior works based on those kinds of assumptions, they're not going to get anywhere because they won't be asking the right questions.
Um,
Questions really matters a lot.
yes. You talk about next generation. We wanted to know some names of psychologists that are going to be the future, that are doing now some good.
Look, I'm an old guy. I can't keep up with all the new names. And I think it's often counterproductive to kind of say, oh, this person's going to be the star tomorrow and this one's just going to do
Don't
half.
worry.
It doesn't work that way. It's often
Okay.
surprising. When I was just getting started, I didn't know where I'd end up. And it's nice now that and if you looked at some of the things I did back then and said, oh, he did those things and they're going to be neat. Well, it turns out that hardly anybody pays any attention to some of that anymore. What I'm really struck by is how a few of my early papers now are being cited a lot, although they weren't a long time ago. It's only in the past few years that I'm seeing citations of my work with Elliot Shimoff and Bud Matthews, in which we did experiments on verbal shaping. There was some follow-throughs and things like that, but it's only in the past, say, 10 years that we've seen a lot of people citing those papers, which is great because it means that people are doing work on those kinds of problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to do those kinds of things, look at citations, and you suddenly find that a lot of people are in different places are taking interest in this work, and then look at those papers, and because they will target the issues which now more and more people are taking an interest in. But then there are neglected areas too, because of concerns about animal welfare, because of concerns about ethics of doing research, both with humans and with animals. We have a much more cumbersome system for people getting through their institutional reviews and getting cleared to be able to do certain kinds of research. And there's some kind of research that is actually it could be problematic, but we don't know anywhere near as much as maybe we should know about aversive procedures. The world is filled with punishers, and people use it on each other. That's what's going on in the Ukraine, and there's all kinds of awful stuff going on. We don't know much about it though, because it became more and more difficult to do those kinds of experiments, and unfortunately people worked with aversive stimuli that had large effects and that were questionable, like electric shock. But there are much more modest kinds of aversive stimuli, like noise, a brief noise, in which it would be possible to study a whole lot of things and look at the basics of punishment, the way we've looked and look at parametric things without a kind of a stimulus that's really totally objectionable. And if we're ever going to want to address these big kinds of issues and that exist at the human level, then we really ought to understand a few more of the basics. What are the kinds of parameters that matter? And so I could say, I'd like to see this happening, but I can't point to people who will be doing it because it's not the kind of thing that people go into as a field. It's harder to get funding for it. It's harder to get it off the ground.
Well,
and just one example of a practical thing it would be nice to know. We know that organisms look at stimuli correlated with reinforcers. They're less likely to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events. But sometimes they do. We do take the call from the doctor, or we do call the doctor to get a diagnosis. And getting that diagnosis might be really an aversive event. If we can learn that something bad's going to happen. It may be that, and I'm talking about observing responses, looking at things. It would be nice to know in, say, an animal model, a non-human model, if organisms are more likely to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events, if they are aversive events they can do something about, than they are to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events in the presence in which they are powerless.
Mhm.
That could then tell us something about, and by the way, a lot of the stuff in fake news, people go to the news they want to hear. They read the things that they're already familiar with. A lot of things that have happened in the media and in all of the internet stuff with social networks and things involve people differentially going to look at some things and not others. Well, we ought to be able, if we knew more about the kinds of reinforcers that maintain that behavior and that lead to isolated systems in which people only talk to this very small community, it'd be worth knowing more about that. And these kinds of basic experiments are relevant to those kinds of situations.
Mhm. Okay, and now we have talked about behavior of Skinner. We have talked about verbal behavior, and I want to ask you now, how do you see with the new technology, new changes, social media, etc. How do you see the taxonomy of verbal behavior right now in our days that everything is changing?
Well, I'd be surprised if if a useful taxonomy was, if that was going to change, unless verbal behavior is changing somehow in a fundamental way. I mean, it's still verbal, even if we've got different media. It's so now our taxonomy does need changes. Now Skinner has it, just for those who might be listening to this who are not familiar with the details. I mean, Skinner proposed a different set of categories than those that exist in everyday talk. So, for example, Skinner talks about some categories that involve replicating verbal behavior, reproducing it. So you could say something, I could write it down. And there are correspondences between what you say and what I wrote, but they are different dimensions. The spoken stuff involves sound, the written stuff involves visual patterns. Or I could show you something I wrote and you could say it.
Mhm.
And those are going from written to spoken. We've learned those correspondences so thoroughly in a lifetime that we don't worry much about whether it's a word written or spoken. We call it a word. But there are people who have who have neurological problems with age, and they develop a thing we call aphasia, which means they've lost some of this but not other parts. So those categories will perhaps change as we learn more about the ways in which they can be separated out because of disease processes. Then there are the categories Skinner talked about as those that make contact with things in the world. He didn't want to talk about reference because reference is in the wrong direction. It starts with the individual who then refers to something that's out there. But the thing is out there, and if you then say its name, the stimulus is out in the environment and the direction is to the speaker who then says the name of that thing. So, I see this and I say scissors. But this is the stimulus that leads me to say it. Skinner created a new term. He called it the tact to describe this relationship. But even that isn't quite satisfactory because then you still start with the speaker then tacting something. We don't have good words for the stimulus occasioning the behavior. And direction matters, just as it mattered to the Greeks to get it right, that the light came from the thing out there and it came into the eye. It's not that the eye sent out something that made contact with the thing you're looking at. The science of optics would not have made sense, or the understanding of the visual system, unless we got that direction right. You had to have the stimulus coming from outside and entering the eye. not looking for something that comes out of the eye and goes out to the object seen. Well, similarly, we've got a language that's a language of reference. I refer to this. I talk about that thing, and it starts with the speaker. And the language is not well suited to the direction that seems to be the best direction to capture when we talk about it, because it's environments that then we talk about. And they lead us to say things, or at least that's one part of verbal behavior. Then you've got the peculiar things that happen when the verbal stuff is all feeding on itself, so that you get these systems. Mathematics, by the way, has some of those properties, which have gotten loose from what really goes on. So you have fantasies, which no longer are stories that people have written, fiction, which no longer has contact with things in the real world. And then you get people who can't tell the difference. And you've got conspiracy theories and so on. We do have some useful pieces that Skinner gave us, but we mustn't assume that that's done. It's a working project, and we're trying to cope with the things that happen with verbal behavior in the world. It's exceedingly complicated, and we need to refine this taxonomy. Find a way that works better. It's not done. We're just beginning. So Skinner offers us an incredible start, and the first piece of it is, can we really just talk about this stuff, not because words are containers for ideas, not because they have meanings inside them. Throw all that stuff away, and let's look at verbal behavior as ongoing behavior and try to deal with it as behavior the way we deal with the behavior of a non-human creature, which is hard for us to do, by the way, because when we look at these non-human creatures, we start thinking about them as doing things the way we do things. We start doing things, and we're talking to ourselves about what we're doing, and we're essentially giving ourselves instructions. And these nonverbal creatures that we try to study, like the pigeons and the rats, they're like aliens to us because they don't talk. And I think the advantage of really getting to know nonverbal behavior is that then when we want to approach verbal behavior as behavior, we're better able to do so if we've studied what nonverbal behavior is like. Because we can do it with all sorts of prejudices.
We are finishing, Charles. We would like to know now your opinion about cognitive science. Your opinion in deep.
Well, and there are some pieces of it that are. I mean, there's lots of beautiful research by cognitive people, but they don't appreciate contingencies. They build computer programs, and so they become very good at teaching computers, but they have not become very good at teaching kids. They've got the wrong subjects. They should be learning how to teach. We know how to teach kids. If we can get a kid on the autism spectrum who is nonverbal to start speaking words, we should be able to teach any kid. But the educational systems, I don't know what your systems are like, but as I look around and see what's going on, some places do better than others. It's very hard to make inroads in educational systems that have all kinds of, I have to say, primitive ways of thinking about how behavior works. And we've got to educate them, and that's hard to do. The other thing about cognitive science is they really don't have a unified way of thinking about what they do that's agreed upon. We have a certain set of things. We know what kinds of expectations we have of our students when they go through any kind of accreditation for doing applied work. And that's shaky because At first, it was an American enterprise, and then there were international kinds of things. But accreditation did get going in Europe, and it's now more on its own, which is maybe a good thing because variations are good. When I did an early version of my learning book, I tried to include cognitive topics in it. And so I had chapters on visualization and these other sorts of things. And there was and one early edition was reviewed by a woman who was a cognitive psychologist. And it was a very favorable review with respect to the parts about behavior analysis. But essentially, her review said that when I was trying to deal with the cognitive things, that I just didn't get it. And after the review came out, I met her at a professional meeting. I think it was the American Psychological Association. And I started asking her what things about cognitive psychology I had missed. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, I really can't tell you exactly, but, there's this person you might talk to. And at first I was kind of depressed by that. But the more I thought about it, the more I said, well, wait a minute, here I am. I'm an interested audience. I want to understand what these other folks are doing. And here's a person who's reasonably prominent enough to be asked to review this book of mine. And I'm asking that person what I need to know. And she can't tell me. She can't tell me what it is about cognitive science that I missed. And maybe the problem is with cognitive science, because they can't say what they all have in common. And in fact, if you get different cognitive science textbooks, you have they different kinds of emphases. Some are emphasizing certain kinds of problem solving, and some are emphasizing machine-human interactions. Maybe the problem is that they haven't decided yet what their field is really about. They're interested in studying the mind. I was involved in a conference once, which was in linguistics. It was, again, a language evolution conference at Harvard. Hadn't been back there for a long time. And the principal speaker was Jackendorf, who at that time I think was the president of some maybe national linguistic organization. And he gave his invited address, and it was a very large auditorium. Chomsky was there. Daniel Dennett was there. There were prominent figures in psychology and in linguistics. And during his talk, he talked about modules, language modules. And one module was replication kind of thing, like the sort of thing I talked about with respect to the textual behavior and taking dictation and those kinds of things. Another module was primitive things like grunts and ejaculations, the ouch and things like that, single word utterances. Some other things had to do with giving instructions to other people, and some had to do with making connections with things in the world. My son had been a student at UMass and had been to a talk that this guy had given, and this guy usually went out for beer afterwards. And my son, in talking to him, found that he said he had read Skinner's Verbal Behavior at some point, which I thought was kind of interesting. Anyway, I just decided, what the hell? They had people going around up and down this was a very big auditorium with microphones if you wanted to ask a question. So I raised my hand and I took the microphone and I said, I find all of this very interesting, but there was an American psychologist who also had a modular theory of language. And he had some modules that were had these properties, and he had names for them and modules in it. And I talked for a little bit, and then I said, you may have guessed by now that the person I'm talking about is B.F. Skinner. The verbal classes that he described are very much like the modules you've described. And I said that having heard from my son that Jackendorf had read Skinner's Verbal Behavior at one time. And I then finished my thing and gave the mic back, and he picked up his mic and he said, well, yes, of course there are these similarities, but Skinner was only interested in behavior. I'm interested in the mind. And that was it. Well, I later talked to someone else, maybe it was Daniel Dennett, who, by the way, still hadn't read Verbal Behavior. And Dennett said that was an interesting ploy. You gave the impression and you got the attention of the audience because it seemed like you wanted to make this point, but you'd temporarily forgotten the name of the speaker. And when you finally dropped Skinner's name, that really kind of made it clear that that had not been the case, that you said this like that. So that was all kind of fun. But the important part of it was, there you've got the same kinds of things, and yet somehow you're interested in this thing. You're not interested in behavior. You're not even saying that verbal behavior is behavior. You're interested in this thing called the mind. I don't know what the future is for that way of thinking about things. And that's what makes me feel somewhat optimistic. I think that some of these things will eventually just fall by the wayside, because where do you ever go with them? We at least start with this notion that we have learned all the words about our thinking and our imagining and our dreaming from other people. And the only way they could have taught us that is if they had access to our behavior. They couldn't get inside. They can't see what we're doing in there any more than, and therefore, since our vocabulary was taught with respect to the stuff that was public and eventually got extended to the stuff that was private, we know better the stuff that's there in the environment than we do about what's going on inside our own heads. And until the cognitive psychologists understand that, I don't see how they can ever get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if you're out there and you're listening and you're a cognitive psychologist. This, I think, is a problem you've got to deal with.
Maybe they can say it to us in the comments below the video. So, well, that was all about the interview. We have to say thanks for your time, for giving us this interview. And one thing that we usually do with our guests is let them tell us something for finishing the interview, something that they want to say to the people that are listening to this interview, or the audience, or for us, or anything you want to say for closing this. So you have your own space for saying.
I thought I did throughout the thing, but I did freely wander around. But when I was a student, and I was deciding on going, it was an easy decision to make. I could remember Nat Schoenfeld pressing me about why I wanted to go on. He said, you don't want to go into psychology to solve your own problems. And apparently I was surprised by the question, because for me, these records we were getting from the rats and the quantitative data and all of that, it was just all so aesthetically satisfying, and things seemed to make sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why he sort of took me under his wing. And when I took his experimental course, because I had that this is not, yes, it is great when these things that we study have practical applications and they can do good. But it is also, I think, one of the things that I find very satisfying is that it is a coherent system. And yes, there are pieces that we've got to still figure out and things that we work on. But when I've tried to summarize bigger hunks of it, like when I did my learning book, something would come along and it would be a little different from other things I'd covered. And the first thing I'd try to do was, well, where in these chapters, where among these well-established classifications and categories, where does this thing best fit? And I found that the system was accommodating of a lot of new kinds of things. It's not a simple one. It's counterintuitive. In fact, I kind of wonder what it is that makes it easier for some people to kind of begin to fall in love with this stuff than for others. And I think the ones who find trouble with it is because they've already got other kinds of preconceptions. I think they come from religious beliefs. They come from other kinds of cultural things that get in the way. So when you approach this, you got to recognize that there's a lot to it. You've got to be patient, and but don't give up on it too easily. Like anything that is complex, it's rewarding. Just like you want to get into music, well, you got to understand some simple things before you can get onto complex things and harmony and orchestration and so forth. But the rewards are rich. There's so much there. A few basics. You've got to learn about selection. It doesn't hurt to have a good background in biology as well. I've found that biology is the place to go to expand on things and to look for analogies that are helpful for where you go next. It's
okay, so
recommend that you spend some time with it.
yeah, of course. So, well, for us, it has been a pleasure to talk with you, to have you in an interview. So we have to say thanks for this this hour, this talk, and we hope to see you again, to talk with you again, and maybe one day, I don't know, even not online format. But
well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And, thank you for the questions and the clarity with which you presented them. That was fine.
We send you a hug.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. See you soon.
Bye-bye.